Thank you both, Sunny and Will, for being here to share some stories. We're going to start with introductions, so if y'all can introduce yourselves and your organizations and tell us a bit about how you know each other. I'll kick us off. I'm Asamia, use she, her pronouns, joining today from Atlanta. I am the Senior Program Associate on the bridging team at Human Impact Partners. And Will, you're going to tell us all about Human Impact Partners in a little bit, but passing it to you both to introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. Sunni Hutton, she, her pronouns, um, coming to you from St. Louis. The organization that I'm a part of is Tenants Transforming Greater St. Louis, formerly Homes for All St. Louis. We did a whole little rebranding in June, but we are the premier organization for tenant organizing in the St. Louis region. We catalyze tenant associations that serve as an accountability mechanism for landlords to improve and or maintain housing quality. And then we come together underneath that umbrella and advocate for a more renter-friendly policy environment.
And I'm Will Dominy. I direct the Housing Justice Program at Human Impact Partners. And we are a national nonprofit. We work to transform the public health field to center justice and equity and build power with social justice movements. And our Housing Justice Program does that kind of work alongside tenant organizers and other folks around the country like Sunny.
Beautiful. Thank y'all. So let us jump in with some background and context. Most people watching or listening to this won't know about your community in St. Louis or your work around code enforcement and housing justice overall. Can you describe the big picture of the issues you've been dealing with and how your work started together and what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, it was 2017. And I remember going to my mother's house and I had like these red bumps all over my body. And she was just like, baby, I hate to tell you, but either that dog you got fleas or you got bed bugs. And I did not want it to be my dog having fleas because I absolutely love my pup. And I was like, I can't go through this. But it turns out I had bed bugs and I reported it to my landlord and he blamed it on the woman who lived in the apartment before me, who now lived in the apartment underneath me. And so I reached out to her, and little did he know, we all start reaching out to each other and like showing receipts that like bed bugs was an issue when she did live up there and he never did anything about it. And in all of our text messages, we found that he was just blaming it on the next person. So like pitting us against each other. But that's how seek to control people and skirt responsibility. But we knew we're like, okay, bed bugs, it's a naturally occurring thing. They live here too. But we know who's primarily responsible for like mitigating this issue. And so we actually all came together and um, we reached out to the health department at the time and reported it. And the health department, like the code enforcement officer came to my apartment like 20 minutes before she was like about to come. She like called me and was like, I'm on my way. And I was just like, no one scheduled anything with me. And I was at work at the time and I didn't even have a car. So I had to bike to get to this appointment for her to inspect the property. And she actually ended up leaving with my landlord. So I never heard back from the health department because we as the tenants, we thought like, oh, well, they're the enforcement. So if anything, they're gonna see it, observe the issue, and tell him that he has to comply and mitigate the issue. But we never heard back from the health department, and that was all of us reported it. And so what we ended up doing was like, okay, what's our options, y'all? Should we leave? But who got first and last month's rent and security deposit and application fees? We're like, we're not in a financial situation to just leave. And if we do leave, he's most likely going to do the same. If he's been doing this for years and like pitting us against each other, he's most likely going to like do it to the next person, just makes room for another victim. So we actually came together, wrote a letter, and told him that if he didn't address it, mitigate the problem, use a specific company, use this method, we zeroed in to that minor of details. Um, and if he didn't do it, then he wouldn't get no rent from us. You know, it was like a 4-unit, multi-unit building. Everyone's paying at least $600 a month at minimum. So you are getting this money from us to, you can mitigate the issue. And by law, it is your responsibility to do so. And then he also got blasted. He was a member of DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. So he also got blasted on the internet. And that was bad for his rep. So he immediately was like, let me get this situated so I don't get kicked out of DSA. But you know, that's not always the story for everyone, that it can end in a win like that. So we actually, I was working with the Community Development Corporation at the time, and they let us use their Community Empowerment Committee meeting to host a mass meeting. So we invited folks, other renters from across the city of St. Louis, from the region actually, and asked them one question: what's your experience of your neighborhood? And overwhelmingly, it was about housing. It was about absentee landlords. It was about sewage in basements that have been there. It was about homes making their children sick. We actually started at that one meeting, and we start meeting I believe it's like every third Wednesday of the month. Our first meeting was in February of 2018, and we decided to keep meeting with each other and rocking with each other. We made a 10-year strategic vision, and code enforcement was one of the areas that we wanted to address. And so that's how we found ourselves doing Home is Where Our Health Is, strategic and supportive code enforcement.
Thank you, Sunny. And so overall, you're saying the catalyst was this very specific situation that the folks in your building were going through. Y'all made connections with each other and had this relationship with the Community Development Corporation.
Yes, the local CDC.
And through there started branching out and getting a better picture of housing issues across the city.
Yes.
And so that kind of moved into campaigns around just general code enforcement and better living conditions for residents.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, is there anything you would like to add to this background?
Yeah, I mean, I would just like expand the frame out a little bit and say, like, this same kind of thing that's happening. So I think part of what's powerful about the story that Sunny's telling is like that was happening in Sunny's building, and then it's citywide, and then from where I sit nationally, like this is going on in cities all across the country, right? Both the kinds of conditions that Sunny and residents in St. Louis are facing, and the health impacts that that result from those, right? It's the bed bugs, it's the lead, it's the asthma triggers, all of that kind of stuff. And also the kind of power issues that she was talking about in terms of like, a landlord being like, oh no, like, it was just the person before you or something, as opposed to fixing it. And I think our entry point to this came primarily through some of our work on corporate landlords who are kind of buying up housing stock across the country. And I say housing stock, I shouldn't say housing stock. They're buying up people's homes across the country to make money, and just growing their market share. Soon we expect almost 50% of homes across the country to be owned by corporations, and building like a huge amount of political power. And so, I think it's one thing to go up against a landlord who, is a local person who's in the DSA, and still like an amazing achievement. And increasingly, I think we're finding, folks whose landlords are these giant corporations. And actually, that's that's something that we found later when we were working with Sunny, that is happening in St. Louis as well, in terms of some of these larger corporate landlords. So all that to say, I think what I want to highlight is both the like kinds of conditions that Sunny's talking about are happening across the country, and there's these real power imbalances. And I think that's what's to me has been really powerful about the work of Tenants Transforming Greater St. Louis, is how they're like really flipping those power imbalances on their head.
I'm trying to think. When did we first meet? I think might have met one of your colleagues at like a Right to the City conference or something like that. It was like a big Homes for All conference or um something like that.
So yeah, I think that was just a little bit before my time, but that sounds about right. I mean, my understanding is like our organizational partnership started kind of out of our mutual connections with Right to the City, which is a national alliance of housing justice organizations that are organizing their communities around the country. And I think coming out of those mutual relationships, my understanding, and again, jump in here, Sunny, but is that we invited you guys and the health department to be part of something called Power Building Partnerships for Health, which is a program that HIP does to try to build kind of working partnerships between health departments and organizers in service of community goals. And I think that particular version of it was focused on housing justice. And as I said, that was before my time. And then I think I got first pulled in when you all asked for some support, reconnecting to the health department, and then starting to build out some local research. And I think that research is really impactful. I'm wondering if you want to talk about that, Sunny.
Yeah. I would say as an organizer, um we our strength is being able to move people, mobilize them towards a common goal. And I do not have expertise in research. I'm not a public health professional, and I don't work in the city to like do enforcement. So that's the reality. So when me and my team decided that we were going to focus in on that code enforcement piece for occupied properties, it we knew we had to bring in strategic partners. And so reaching out to HIP was a part of that. We were like, okay, we we know we're not researchers, so we actually reached out to HIP, and Sook was really there to help us with data analysis. We reached out to a local university, um, Professor Yearby. She was at SLU, but she's at Ohio State now. So we reached out to her, and she had already done some initial research about housing and renters' rights legislation and the enforcement of that in like multiple jurisdictions. So we pulled her and her team into this, and then we also pulled together a local city person, Laura Ginn, who has GIS mapping skills. So I think this kind of gets more into the idea of capacity in terms of like who we move and bring into the space, because we understand that all of these different stakeholders are going to be key in order to like reaching our ultimate goals. But ultimately, we were like, okay, we need to address the code enforcement process for occupied properties, because Missouri is very heavy, like landlord state. Um, Lots of options for landlord rights, but how can we improve housing quality that's impacting people's health, um, reduce these kind of negative health outcomes that are coming out of some of the most impacted areas? And then on top of that, we want the housing to get to compliance, but we also want some accountability, because as you heard from my story earlier, we think this is the enforcement arm, and then you call and you never hear from them again. So we really felt like there were some inequities built within the system that needed to be revised, that needed to be fixed and solved. And we felt like we were, as renters, and as like the organization that brings renters together, that we were a key role in doing that. We felt like we have the authority and power to.
Sunny, just wanted to ask you to just clarify a little bit where the current campaign is. I initially y'all had a very specific goal and aim, and you've been talking about how that has shifted over time to center equity, accountability, and to not only focus on code enforcement, but also the overall health and well-being of renters. Currently, is there a specific campaign or specific target that y'all are like tackling at this current moment?
Yeah, so home is where our health is. It's a really long name. Supportive and strategic code enforcement. We were we were like, we need to revamp the code enforcement process, because externally we saw that there was already an issue with it when we weren't able, as residents, to get the enforcement that we needed. We are also fully aware of the stories of the people in our base who have shared about the health impacts of it. So we said this entire system needs an overhaul. um, and we also saw it as a way to prevent displacement, because we do understand that code enforcement can be used as a tool to take property or displace folks. Specifically, like some of those seniors are low income senior homeowners, and of course, renters. Um, so when we approached how we would go about like trying to figure this out, we said we wanted to process map the entire code enforcement process for occupied properties. So that's starting from when a resident calls, because that's how it's done here. Everything is initiated by the resident. So we process map the entire code enforcement process for the building division and the health department, and then identify pain points within that process. And then from those pain points, we would create collectively solutions to address them. On top of that, we also did an ecosystem scan to see what resources are available to folks if there are some home repair issues or housing quality issues. Um, and again, like I said, let's generate some solutions. Those solutions could have been policy, it could be programmatic, it could also be, external ones that are not the responsibility of the city, but maybe some like outside partners or community-based organizations can take on. So we've done that, and we drafted a brief, and the brief basically did like some geospatial analysis of the zip codes within the city of St. Louis, and overlaid that on top of health data. And what it showed us is that zip codes with greater Black populations also have greater housing code violations that can impact health. So things like lead, rodents, pest, even mold and poor plumbing that could in turn lead to mold are much more prevalent in communities of color. Um, and it's also connected to some of the most negative health outcomes, including like chronic lower respiratory disease, asthma triggers, ER visits, and even like developmental issues. So we saw this, and we're like, okay, there's a clear connection between housing quality and health, and there's things happening within how the code enforcement process is carried out that is contributing or exacerbating these issues. We got to a point, we drafted that brief, and then we came up with some solutions, and we actually were able to get a few of them passed. So the mold ordinance is actually being reviewed on the 19th in the HUD's committee. So the mold ordinance would lead to mold mitigation, because that was not on our housing code books. Safe temperatures in rentals, which require a cooling system during the hot summer months, that was not on our that was not in our books. It is now. We also passed a rental registry to be able to track who owns these properties and how many rental properties do we have. Because what was happening in that code enforcement process, our inspectors, if they didn't have a contact to send the code violation to. So if you don't have a person to call or contact to hold accountable, you're never going to get to compliance. And then we also passed the tenant relocation assistance, which is the impacted tenants fund, which provides relocation assistance for tenants whose properties are condemned to no fault of their own. We've also put forth some operational recommendations as well, like sending a letter of the code violation to tenants so that they are aware of the conditions happening on their property so that they can make an informed decision. Like that was not a thing, crazy enough. Or accepting other forms of payment for code violation citations. The health department can only accept cashier's check, and over the past years have not been associating a fee with their code violation citations. They're allowed to by law, but they haven't because they can only accept cashier's check. So it's crazy. It's like small things, operational things like that that could lead to inefficiencies within a system and inequity, and continue to drive inequities that is ultimately impacting people's health. So where we've actually, as a coalition, because we've brought on public health professionals, city departments, all of which who touch code enforcement. And then we also have our community partners who are developers and or residents, both low-income homeowners and renters. We have divided ourselves into committees. So we have our advocacy committee that's really focused on pushing the policy. And then we have our technical assistance committee, and they're focused on the implementation of the policy and the training and the capacity building and training up of the city departments so that they can actually carry out the work. And then we have like our public outreach and communications committee that's focused on making sure that residents and all different partners and stakeholders are aware of these changes and what's happening.
And I would just add, I think, the wins that you've had are really amazing, Sunny, and I think will make some real, real changes in people's material lives, and especially around like racial equity and health in St. Louis. And I think one of the other changes that's been really exciting for me to see as a little bit of an outsider is just like how you're changing how business gets done, and how governing works. I think at least when I was like young and trying to get into organizing, like I just understood government as like the them, and we would just like go and the protest and try to be like, it was like the man kind of, and we'd try to get the man to do different things. And I've certainly grown more nuanced over time, and seen just like a huge amount of nuance and strategy in the ways that you have really built. You've described it as a coalition, and you've really anchored a set of people that includes, folks at the city, nonprofits, like elected officials. You've really pulled in a wide set of people under your leadership, right? Like under community leadership towards like very focused on racial and housing justice. Like that is, that's the agenda that you've set. And then you invited all these people to the table. Like I feel like movements are always like, how do we get a seat at the table? You have created your entire own new table that is the kind of tables that we need to get to liberation, to get to like health, and then invited the people you need to like actually, to get there. And so like I think when I first started attending some of those meetings and saw like who you'd actually managed to convene, and then how invested everyone was in that vision that you're putting out, that has left me deeply impressed. And I think, HIP's been, you've organized us in that same way, right? Like we ended up contributing because you were like, here's your role, here's how you fit in, like let's go. And I think that's really compelling. Like, beyond just the wins that you're making, like the way that you're working, I think is really compelling.
Yeah, I'm glad you framed it in that way. We did see ourselves as the ones to pull this table together. Um, and in my initial outreach, I started off with just like sending out an email and and telling people like what the program was, what the coalition was, our intended goals. I gave them a timeline, and I had one-on-ones with every single stakeholder and told them what their role would be. Um, and surprisingly enough, because like you said, we're used to being on the outside telling people, like saying like this is what we want you to do, and we just expect it to happen. Surprisingly enough, many of the folks involved, and even like the municipal actors, they they wanted this. They saw it as like, yo, we actually do need to change it. And so, even some of them who were probably not, even if they weren't the director of the division, maybe they're just an inspector supervisor. They saw it as an avenue to get some of the things that they've seen long term to get those issues addressed. And we've been able to do that for them. And it's when we sat down in our first coalition meetings, we said, okay, what are our values? What are going to be the things that we root ourselves in, and that when we make decisions about, um, the solutions we want to see or how we want to see them implemented, what are we going to go back to? And these groups who you would think have opposing um, opposing goals or intentions actually meant everyone was like, yeah, we need to root ourselves in racial equity. um, we need to think about whatever solutions we create, reduce environmental harms. We need to repair relationships, build trust, uh, be transparent with one another, and that's through data and all these other things. I was like, dang, I ain't even know I didn't even know y'all was down like that. I was actually surprised, and I expected a lot of potential like friction or tension around those values, even around the decision making. We decided how are we going to make decisions. Folks said they wanted consensus. They said, yeah, we'll give committees, the freedom to make decisions. But when we come into this larger group, we want to make decisions off consensus. And consensus for some people takes too long. They're like, it takes too long to get everybody on board. But folks wanted to make sure that everybody that's going to be impacted by this, everyone that has a role, um, actually agreed to what we put forth. And it's I'm glad to say that we did use consensus, and I'm proud of what came out of it, because when I stood in front of the HUD's committee, the Housing and Urban Development and Zoning Committee, in the city of St. Louis, I could say these solutions are not just solutions from community, which should be enough, but hey. These are not just solutions by community. These are solutions that have been researched, have been vetted by all of these different departments who touch this. So they have consented and agreed to moving this type of this legislation, and then have also agreed that, yeah, we may not have the capacity now, but we need to build to get to the capacity for implementation of this. So these are people who are actually going to be carrying it out as well. And it was also great to be like, and folks who are building the houses and who are landlords are also saying that they support this. Uh, yeah, thank you for framing it in that way, Will. We
Um,
we recognized our power and said, y'all need to come to this table.
mhm. I love everything about where this conversation has gone. I just want to zoom out just for a second, and then we'll continue down this thread, because I'm hearing a lot of inside outside strategy. I'm just going to define it for our audience. and then have some really like pointed questions around like how organizers were like, screw the table, we're making our own table and we're gonna invite the inside actors to the table. I think there's so much power in that. But let me just frame inside outside strategy and then kick it back to you all. So we love to hear about your experience with what we call inside outside strategy. It can be challenging to have productive collaborations, excuse me, between government agencies like health departments and community power building organizations, which are part of social justice movements that can approach government as the target of their community organizing. We talk about inside outside strategy as the intentional alignment and coordination between people inside of government and community power building organizations on the outside, working in partnership to achieve a common aim. It involves each side using their relative power, voice, and resources to create the policy and systems change called for by the community. It can take a lot of different forms in different places and can change over time. So let's dive into that. So I heard so much about all the different folks and groups that formed this coalition and who were able to step in and really shape where the work is now. I think if it feels important to you all to kind of name the specific roles you are playing, but I think more importantly, can we take a moment to share an example of what comes to mind when someone either from the inside or the outside really demonstrated leadership in your campaign? And Sunny, I think we're gonna kick it to you to start. Yeah.
Yeah, let me think about that. Let me get back to that question. What's an example that comes to mind when someone demonstrated leadership in the campaign? Um,
Selma, edit what I'm saying out. But Sunny, this is when you wanted to talk about the funder story.
oh yeah, but then I changed it though.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the honestly what just popped in my head was me thinking about one of our resident leaders. So we have code enforcement fellows, which are simply just residents um who participate in like the coalition, offering their experience. Um they have an active role in like making decisions, cultivating solutions. They even attend the trainings that we have have for the city of St. Louis. So one person in particular is Cassandra, and she, um, I think she like snaps everybody, like regrounds everyone, and like snaps them back into reality when people typically say things like, "Well, this is just how we've always done it," and she questions that every single time. And because of who she is, because she is an impacted resident, people listen because we know and understand that her experience of the system is the reality and is valuable to revamping and creating and like creating systems that actually work for people. Um, so she is always just like, well, why we can't do this? And we'll always be like, you know what? As especially as like municipal actors, they're like, huh, I never thought of that. Yes, because you're so engulfed in how things have traditionally been ran that they actually fail to step back and even like question the system or think of alternative ways of doing things. So I think she demonstrates leadership um, because of her being a recipient and an ongoing user of these systems. Her experience is valuable and she ain't tainted like the rest of us already. She ain't caught up in all that. So she always demonstrates leadership to me, and I'm telling you, when she speaks, we stop and listen. Um, Other ways I've seen like leadership demonstrated, um, I expected because I've worked with like the city before. When I lived in my old neighborhood, we were trying to um, get the waste management systems together because we were experiencing like so much waste, so much illegal dumping, all this other jazz. And we like brought those folks to the table, and they were very resistant. It started off good, but then eventually it started to get real secretive and they didn't want to share data. Then we had the sunshine request, and that took forever. Um, I think there are municipal actors who showed a level of like fearlessness when they were actually transparent with us, providing us with data and like sharing the real experience of what their day to day looked like and the issues that they ran into. Um, I think that was a level of fearlessness, and even for some, like um, using their position of power to influence what was happening, like what we were deciding collectively, like to make sure to help that, to like push the process forward and to help move some of those solutions we wanted. I think, um, yeah, it was really dope of them to go ahead and flex that power for us within the system. So that's what I think about when I think about that inside outside strategy,
Mhm.
out of what was happening on the outside and what people were willing to do on the inside. Oh, and I got to shout out my teammate, Sarah. Sarah. So, I'm the lead organizer on this, but that don't mean I do everything. People got to understand when you're an organizer, you know to tap everybody else, to tap people in areas where it may not be your strength. And even if it is your strength, the thing is you ain't got enough arms to do everything. So Sarah is our field organizer. And she would actually, when it came to like us having to show up at hearings to speak to the policies that we wanted changed, Sarah would be the one tapping our base and training them and preparing them for those hearings. So we were able to, hear the voice of impacted residents, and well, not just us, but legislators were able to hear the voices and hear real stories, which I think helped to move this legislation along. So yeah, shout out to Sarah.
Shout out to Sarah. Shout out to you. Shout out to everyone. I had a question specifically when you were talking about the municipal actors showing fearlessness. We're just gonna jump down a little bit to get a better sense of what the political landscape was like at that time, at the start of your work, and where it's at now. Because I'm wondering, for the folks working in government who were able to show that fearlessness, was there something going on behind the scenes, or what were the challenges or like the opposition like that made it so there were other folks who started to get stingy with the data, or who were kind of not as fearless as you needed them to be?
So St. Louis is a Democratic city, and so the majority of everyone, our legislators identify as Democrats. We do not have not one Republican on our board of aldermen, which is like a city council for other cities. Um, and we have a mayor, Tashara Jones, and she's first Black female mayor for the city of St. Louis. And she has a pretty aggressive and like equity focused agenda. So even our St. Louis Development Corporation and CDA, they have like an equity based economic development plan that focuses on investing in communities of color that have been historically divested from. Like there was this whole Team 99 plan that was done in the 70s where they actually said, don't make investments here, put your money into communities that are already strong, which were primarily white communities. And that's what the city did. So she came in with a pretty aggressive plan to invest in communities of color, which are majority of them are north of Delmar, so like the north side, the west side, and have been following through with that plan. So I think for us, it was kind of opportune to kind of enter into this space at this time, because we do have support from the mayor's office. And I think additionally, this slate of aldermen that we have also are very much progressive, forward thinking. And I would also say we went from like 28 alders to 14 because of the population decreases that we have in the city. We used, yeah, girl, we under 300,000 people, and that is yikes. That is not a major metropolitan area if you ask me. But so we did go down. Our population decreased, so our aldermen, we have to do some, readjusting of the borders and stuff. And so we had less alders to deal with this time around. So we didn't have to go through 28 people, just 14. So I think that also made it easier to navigate. And then the fact that this slate of alder people are very much like progressively focused. We actually do. There was a board of aldermen election and also a mayoral election a couple years back, and we actually did, what do you call them? We did like town halls, where we would moderate and ask them questions related to housing justice and renters' rights. And so we had all of the candidates for the mayoral race participate, and all of them except one, who happened to be a Republican candidate, said that they would support housing justice, a tenant bill of rights, and all that jazz. And then we did the exact same thing with the board of aldermen, and the majority of them, except one, who is a landlord herself, said that they would put forth, and that they are in support of housing justice and a tenant bill of rights. So we're political landscape wise, we're in a good place. However, we do deal with preemption because we are a red state. So there are a lot of things preempted on a state level. And that's not new for us. We've been like this for decades. Um, and preemption, in my opinion, is not something I fear. It's just an obstacle to navigate. But we're already pretty much familiar with it. Um, and we also brought in support from like Change Lab Solutions that could assess the state level preemption laws, and any policies that we put forth, would have them review it to see, do we have precedents for it. So we really didn't touch anything that would go to the state level. We actually just focused on what we had control over in the city, and we actually have a lot of control over stuff. Um, so that state level work that may have to move further in the future, we're making plans for that. But in terms of the political landscape, it was primed for us and ready to go.
Love that for you. Okay, thank you for that. I have a two-pronged question for capacity. Sunny, I'm gonna kick the first half to you and then Will to you as well. So for Sunny, I heard you talk about the coalition structure and how that came to be. And so wondering how, like, if you could talk a little bit about how the coalition structure supported the capacity of the campaign, right? My assumption is like that kind of core group of folks that y'all convene who are operating across multiple spheres, who are different lenses, really helped to bolster the work and like ensures longevity. So if that is accurate, speak to that. If not, correct me. And then if there's anything else that contributed to the overall capacity, so Sunny, remember that, and then Will, if there was a role that you think had played to help kind of add capacity to the campaign, if you could speak to that after Sunny.
Yeah, can you bring
Let's
that
run
question?
that back.
Yeah.
Yes. So what helped support your capacity and what did you need to build up for it to be successful? Specifically, like how the coalition contributed to capacity or whatever else may have added capacity to the work.
Yeah, I would say um the way that I saw it as an organizer, I knew that I had to, this is what we're taught, like, you pull people into the folds that will help build your capacity. And so that meant that we had to take into consideration the research needs, which HIP was able to provide. Um, and then and of course those other um, university partnerships that we had. um, we knew we also needed like legislative support in terms of like drafting ordinances, or assessing the um, political landscape in terms of the preemption, or what we can do, what we can't do. And so we did bring in Change Lab Solutions, and I think, Will, you made that connection for us, to connect with Greg Mao over at Change Lab Solutions, and they had already had like a hefty body of work, um, pertaining to code enforcement, which was absolutely, it was just extremely helpful. I actually pulled a lot of the research that I did on my own. I pulled it from Change Lab Solutions website. And then we also had another university partner that provided us with a student who could do some like best practices research. That student, crazy enough, that student ended up having some family issues. So I had to continue that research. And luckily, I was able to like remember how, the small things that college taught me and do that research on my own. But then we also brought in, we had another university partner that helped with like drafting legislation. That was WashU's Environmental Law Clinic. And um, I think even making sure that the solutions that we created were robust, we made sure that we had a good amount of people that were impacted, that touch code enforcement, are in the public health field, had expertise, who are landlords themselves. Like we made sure, because we couldn't, yeah, we could make some solutions up ourselves, but definitely having all those people and viewpoints makes things a lot much more robust, and makes you think about the, well, what if this happens? um, and I'm thinking there was another support that we have in order to carry out this work in terms of capacity. um, Oh, yes, I was talking about the legislative part. So we actually pulled in the president of the Board of Aldermen's office, and this is a brand new, spanking new position that they added, and it's like a legislative coordinator or director, like that, and she actually sets out a plan for what legislation is going to be passed, and they even do the research on it and draft the legislation too. So we made sure that they were a part of the process as well. Yeah, in terms of capacity, all of that, all those people. And we needed money to do this too. So we were able to get an initial grant from the Missouri Foundation for Health to carry out this work, which was extremely helpful. I've come to find, though, from bringing my team onto this, when we initially drafted that grant proposal, it was just supposed to be, a policy organizer and like an assistant. Um, but I've come to find out that I've had to tap my team in so many different ways. So a portion of their time needed to be accounted for. And so moving forward, we actually are no longer funded by the Missouri Foundation for Health. So it really, in order for this to continue to be successful, we're going to need additional funding um, to make sure that we can compensate our team members for their time, and even pay for the training. We've been, for the past 2 years, we've been the ones paying for the Strategic Code Enforcement Management Academy for the city of St. Louis to attend. Um, if that's going to keep happening, and we also plan on bringing the Strategic Code Enforcement Management Academy to St. Louis, we're going to need funding to cover that. So we're looking at about like 600K to cover this type of work. It's, no easy feat.
Asamia, can you remind me what you want me to speak to?
Sunny touched on it.
Okay.
But if there's anything you want to add around how HIP potentially added capacity.
Yeah.
Sunny talked about the research.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I didn't talk
Yeah.
about
I mean, I think the key thing right now for me is that we're up against a lot of power, up against a lot of political power. And, Sunny hasn't mentioned this as much, but like Sunny was also an advisor to some research we just completed around the health harms of corporate landlords. And we were drawing kind of parallels between, the work that they're doing locally and then this more national work around corporate landlords. And I think, it's what we're finding is that landlords have always had a ton of power and are getting more and more power, especially as they consolidate and turn into these like super, super hedge funds or private equity firms. Um, and so I think part of what, public health has always had a charge of protecting people in their homes. That's always been a part, like that's actually some of the foundational moments of public health. We're doing that type of work. And I think there's a lot of good people. I've done this kind of work who are trying to do the best that we can in that and facing huge barriers in terms of the amount of power that the landlord lobby in particular has. And I think it's really going to take the power of both community organizers and local governments and all, government at all scales to really like push back around that power. I think we need to be kind of clear-eyed about the amount of power that we have. And right now it is not enough to win the kinds of things that people need in their lives. And so I think, our kind of like strategy at HIP is how do we help build up community power, support community power? We're very clear organizing gets the goods, like the kind of work that Sunny's doing. That's how we make change. And it is really helpful when we have folks within government also pushing those same kinds of things. And Sunny's been talking about that. So I think our role, in this is trying to bring some of those strategies together and do what we can to kind of like incubate or support the capacity to bring those two strategies together. So, I think we did that through the Power Building Partnerships for Health program in St. Louis, where we helped, kind of like build some of those cross connections between Sunny's team and local government. And, Sunny, I think what I heard from you was that it wasn't the entire thing that made change possible, but that it did help, and feel free to elaborate. But what I've heard from you is that it did help create some of the like familiarity with each other, help create a little bit more of an in local government, and help create more of the just like, oh, this is a reasonable way of working. And we don't have to kind of like stay in those silos of like, you're in the community, you're over, you're an organizer, you're a bureaucrat, like, and never the twain shall meet. So I think that's part of what we try to do is like, be like, no, actually, y'all, we need each other to like actually assemble enough power to win the things that we need. I think another thing that we kind of have been experimenting with and experimented with Tenants Transforming Greater St. Louis is really like doing our research in an embedded way. Like often we kind of like loan our support to community organizations and are like, hey, would you like a report? Would you like some research? And in this case, Sook actually just started like joining the meetings, facilitating meetings, assembling the research, like actually just sort of like serving as sort of like a research consultant to Tenants Transforming Greater St. Louis. And I think what I heard from you, Sunny, is that you established a certain amount of credibility by being able to put out in the world and be like, we are the people who are actually doing this research and can say with some degree of legitimacy, like what's happening in the community, because like we're the people like putting the report down on the table. So I think that's another place that we tried to kind of just like add some capacity by supporting you all in kind of stretching into some of those new new capacities for you and doing that kind of research. And then finally, I think I would say like one other way that we've tried to support is really like amplifying the work that you guys are doing, because I think it really is a set of work that should be seen nationally, and held up nationally. And like, I think our hope is that in doing so, that can also lend some support for the kinds of strategies that you're moving. So that's how we've tried to add some capacity, and hopefully those strategies have been successful.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Will. And my apologies for not hitting on that. Just so much to cover. But I said to myself and to my team, I was like, y'all, we got to do a report because no one. It's as if like reports validate our experiences as impacted people, people of color. Like a report got to come out for funders to listen, and for a lot of like, not all, but for some legislators, they have to see a report as well for it to like really sit with them and for it to be of like validity. And so your team did provide us with that validity with Sook serving, and I even forgot about the work that we did behind the scenes, Will, when you were like, okay, how can we generate more buzz about this, and even incorporating us into the corporate landlords report again, like gave us another like stamp of approval and key validation. And let's be for real, that local foundation that I was talking about, they wouldn't have funded us. We had to tie on that deliverable of a report for it to even like seem for it to make sense to them. Um, so yeah, I do remember, you, me, Christian, trying to figure out, okay, where are these different avenues that we can, blow this up and spread the word more. So thank you for taking an active role in helping us identify, where we could share our story and really highlight the work that we did. And it also helped that the corporate landlords report was putting forth recommendations that we were also putting forth. So that like echoing.
Well, it helped us because you wrote a lot of those recommendations, and we had the pleasure of being able to amplify them nationally. So yeah.
Smooth. Okay, thank y'all for that. We have like two more questions and then we'll wrap for real, for real. Um, we heard Sunny, you kind of walked us through how in the first meeting y'all set values. Y'all wanted to ensure that whatever work came out of this like coordinated effort centered racial equity, it reduced environmental harm. There was trust and repair happening, transparency and data sharing. If there's anything else you want to add around like what was the analysis, the North Star, like the vision behind the work, I feel like you kind of painted a beautiful picture, but if there's anything you want to add to that before we go to our reflection question and our closing.
Yeah, I think for me and my team throughout this process, we came in with some preconceived notions about who we were working with, specifically when it came to those city actors. And they surprised us. And then but we also got like the inside scoop on like what kind of, because usually typically we're on the outside and we're saying we want this and we want it now. And then we got a taste of that bureaucracy and was like, this is why things are slow. Yeah, like I remember one of our recommendations, we were excited about the rental registry happening, but then found out that there was a previous contract, previous technology contract that had not been paid out. And according to our charter, the city couldn't go into another contract, another technology contract with another consultant or third party until that one was resolved. And so people were like running around like chickens with their head cut off, trying to figure out where is this contract, who owns it, where's the original paper where it was signed, because we can't move forward with rental registry. Oh yeah, it passed, but like operationally it couldn't happen until that was resolved. So just getting a taste of that and seeing like there's a lot more at play, that could prohibit, uh, really great solutions and new operating systems moving forward because of these like little small hiccups in the system. And so that made us a little bit more annoyed still, but gave us a little bit more like understanding of how the system works. And we really found out that like we had to go beyond the demands or the solutions, and we had to be hand in hand with these departments when throughout implementation. And the thing is, even once implementation happens, we're going to have to still be there tracking and making sure, like seeing like how, what's the impact of it, so then we can bring that data back to them and say, here's this data. You can use it so that you can continuously improve these systems. Legislators can use it to identify any more possible gaps in policy. And then residents can use it for more targeted advocacy. So yeah, it's an ongoing process. Um, and I know we're probably gonna get into challenges later when we wrap up. But yeah, I got plenty to say about that. Will, you got some thoughts?
Well,
No,
I just
I'm loving your focus on implementation and sort of following the full policy cycle. I've been in so many campaigns where it's just like about getting it over the finish line, and then it's kind of like, well, that's our job, and then government go do it. And I think the level of kind of like nuance and follow through you're thinking about, I think is just I'm just liking it. So
Mhm. And y'all just organically went into our question around like lessons learned, talking about implementation, talking about walking hand in hand and making sure that you see things all the way through. If there's anything else y'all want to add in terms of like lessons learned or advice to give to folks who are engaging in inside outside strategy or considering it, especially in this moment.
You had something on your brain, Will. I saw it.
Me too.
well, I mean, you just got me thinking about this political moment and how complicated, we've been talking about government as a force for good here, right, on this call. And I think government is a tool like anything else, and people with power use tools for the things that they want to use tools for. And so I just think the conversation is going to need a little bit more nuance over the next period as we think about, how do we really shore up the kind of partnerships that you've been building, Sunny, and really fortify ourselves locally where we can, um, and understand that, some governments, for some communities, governments have never really come through or have often done harm, and then some are really poised to do like really tremendous harm right now. And so that's what was going through my face, and I was like, oh God, like how do we even talk about that like in a way that makes sense in this conversation? And I think I guess the only meaning I can make from that is just like, I do think we will need these kind of partnerships where we can build them to protect our communities, and to demonstrate like what, I think there's forces in this country right now really trying to challenge the idea of meeting our needs collectively at all, whether that's government or, more mutual aid, or, all the ways that we've organized ourselves to kind of like love and protect and feed and clothe and support each other. That's under attack. And just like, how do we continue to build these kind of partnerships, and just enforce the legitimacy of like, we should be doing that together. We should be doing that kind of support. So that's what was going through my mind.
Yeah, thank you for that, Will. I sometimes this can be seen as like I think a lot of people have been like really concerned about the most recent election. Uh, for I'm sure there may be things that happen that will affect us locally, but as a resident in a blue city in a red state, it ain't nothing new to me. So we'll be mindful, but we'll continue to push ourselves and operate and advocate for what we believe in. I throughout this process, it's things have been going like so smoothly and surprisingly, I'm like, this is too good to be true. And then we had the buildings division commissioner who originally signed the MOU um, retire. And so for some time, we experienced, an interim, and then that interim went on paternity leave. And then finally, we got a new commissioner who does not understand, right? Or who we don't have a relationship with. So this is I think this is a challenge for that many people will run into when you're doing inside outside strategy, and that's the ever changing leadership. And then you have to like reorient this new person to the work and like build trust, and that you can't do that in the limited amount of time that funders give you, right? It that type of stuff can take years, and yeah, so we're up against that right now. A new MOU has not been signed by the newest building commissioner. Our Although his staff still continues to participate, and those our committee meetings still continue to go on. Legislation continues to be put forth. Like all of the work is still happening. Um, but what we're realizing is that those partnerships have to be codified. And in a way, like MOU is great, but it has to be codified beyond that MOU. So moving forward, we're going to be putting forth legislation to codify this cross department collaboration um, between departments for the purposes of um, code enforcement for these occupied properties. Um, and I know for some folks in the coalition, I'm thinking of the person who said this like, maybe she said this like a year ago. Okay. She was like, Sunny, we need to codify this. We need to mandate it via ordinance. And we had all the partnerships, so we didn't think we were like, yes, but in terms of the timeline, we didn't think we would have to do this so soon. And so yeah, we're definitely learning from that and now building legislation to codify uh, this process, and what it looks like and what the deliverables will be and what the purpose is and who would make up this task force or committee. So moving forward, no matter who is in power, they know that they have to come to this table. And whether it be a table, we'll discuss that, whether it be a table that we facilitate or not, as long as the work uh, is continually carried out, is what we care about.
Wonderful. Sunny, you answered our closing question about what's next on the horizon. So thank you for that. Well, I don't know if there's anything you would like to contribute regarding that. No. Cool. Alrighty. Any closing words? Any things left unsaid? No?
No,
Yeah.
I would go ahead, Sunny.
I mean, we do have a lot of things on the horizon. We put a brief online on our website at homeishealth.org. But there is actually a full version that outlines the policies and operational recommendations for that we want to put forth. And that's for like the span of the next like 2 to 5 years. So like I said, even if it's without us, even though I doubt that completely, um, yeah, there will be there's a plan put forth for the city to follow through to ensure greater protections and housing quality for renters. Everything from proactive rental inspections to externally creating landlord grades. So yeah, look look for that upon the horizon.
Yeah,
Well,
and I would just say thanks, Asamia, for having me and Sunny here today. Once again, I feel like the work that they're doing there in St. Louis is really kind of setting the tone that folks in other parts of the country should be paying attention to. So thanks for kind of shining a spotlight.
mhm. Thank you both. Listen, St. Louis, Sunny, you said you have 300,000 residents, small but mighty, and there were so many things to learn from what y'all have been able to do. So I just want to thank you both for being here with us and sharing this story. Cool.